This naturalrefrigerants.com article is being read by an automated voice. Pesticides NGO disputes chemical companies' interpretation of TFA toxicity studies. By Michael Gary. Published October 14, 2025. The Pesticide Action Network, PAN. Europe, a Brussels-based NGO, has released a report that challenges industry interpretations of animal studies looking at the toxicity of trifluoroacetic acid, TFA, a byproduct of some F gases, pesticides, and other chemicals. The report, Manufacturing Doubt, How the Industry Downplays TFA's Toxicity, is based on Pan-Europe's analysis of chemical manufacturer-supported studies to watchdog whether the industry would attempt to cast doubt on the toxicity of the substance in order to secure weaker regulation of TFA and TFA-emitting chemicals. Authors of the report at PAN Europe include environmental scientist and toxicologist Angeliki Lissamachu, head of science and policy, Hans Meulermann, chemicals officer, and Salome Roynel, policy officer on pesticide risk assessment. PAN Europe has also published Europe-focused studies on TFA in surface and drinking water, wine and bread/cereal products. In its report, PAN Europe targets chemical companies that have supported TFA animal studies individually or together in a TFA task force. These include pesticide manufacturers BASF, Bayer, Corteva, and Syngenta, TFA producer Solvay, and F-gas producers Chemours and Honeywell. In March, the EU banned the TFA producing pesticide flufenacet, while in July, Denmark banned 8 pesticides that conform TFA. PAN. Europe calls for all TFA producing pesticides to be banned. Solvay announced in September that it would cease production of TFA and its derivatives by early 2026. While environmental TFA has multiple sources, a 2022 report by the German Environment Agency, UBA, estimated that emissions of certain refrigerants like HFO, 1234YF, and blowing agents, due to their breakdown in the atmosphere, were the largest annual source of TFA in Germany, producing about 2,000 metric tons. This is followed by the breakdown of pesticides at about 457 metric tons of TFA and pharmaceuticals at about 29 metric tons. Additional TFA sources include wastewater and landfills, industrial releases, and the breakdown of fluorinated polymers. The proliferation of TFA in the environment has been widely studied, raising concerns about its impact on human health, compounded by the fact that TFA is costly and energy-intensive to remove from water. According to Pan Europe, for decades, chemical companies selectively framed data, avoided conducting critical long-term studies until legally compelled and advanced speculative arguments to downplay adverse effects of TFA. In addition, they proposed a TFA drinking water limit of 294 micrograms per liter, that is more than 100 times higher than the most protective national standard in Europe. The Netherlands' 2.2 micrograms per liter, and disregards the protection of vulnerable groups, including babies and children, said the NGO. While animal studies are not determinative of human toxicity, the precautionary principle must apply, said PAN Europe. The persistence, mobility, and toxicity of TFA mean that waiting for further proof will only deepen irreversible contamination. Regulatory decisions should reflect worst-case exposure scenarios and explicitly protect vulnerable populations. The NGO also argued that strong rules are needed to ensure that risk assessments are independent from industry influence, both at the EU and member state level. Adding transparency, rigorous standards, and independent scientific expertise are essential to avoid regulatory capture, biased assessments, and the prioritization of corporate interests over public health. The Pan Europe reports highlights the concern that certain actors are downplaying evidence and open questions about TFA's harmful effects, said Hans Peter Arp, environmental chemist and technical expert at the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute and professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Even more troubling is their opposition to the use of the precautionary principle, despite the increasing number of alarm bells, manifested in growing indications of TFA toxicity, rising exposure levels among the general population at an unprecedented rate, and the impossibility to remove this substance from the environment in a way that lowers exposure. Each day we are ingesting more TFA than we are eliminating, and we have very limited data on chronic, lifelong exposure. We must no longer tolerate the manufacturing of doubt, added Arp. Instead, we should apply the precautionary principle by taking all feasible steps to limit TFA emissions, while simultaneously collecting the data needed to prevent risks from spiraling out of control. This is especially critical because TFA represents an intergenerational issue. The decisions we make today will affect the potential risks faced by future generations. ARP is the lead author of a 2024 study that characterized TFA as a planetary boundary threat. Turning point in 2017. The Pan-Europe report tracked the evolution of TFA studies, which began in the 1980s, and recent regulatory responses. A turning point did not come until 2017 when the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, requested chemical producers to carry out and deliver 2 long-term toxicity studies on TFA. The first was done by Solvay and Bayer, and the second by the TFA task force at the time, excluding Corteva, Chemours, and Honeywell. These studies, beginning in 2021, showed that TFA could harm rabbits and rabbit offspring, notably with eye and skeletal abnormalities in offspring, triggering several regulatory responses. Germany formally proposed in 2025 that TFA and its trifluoroacetate salts be classified by ECHA as reproductively toxic, very persistent and very mobile under the EU's Classification, Labeling, and Packaging (CLP) regulation. TFA, many F-gases, and pesticides fall under the scientifically endorsed definition of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, a broad category of chemical pollutants known as forever chemicals. Using this definition, ECHA has since 2023 been evaluating a universal PFAS restriction proposal from the national authorities of Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden to restrict PFAS as a class. Furthermore, the European Commission has asked the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, to review the recommended toxicological reference values, acceptable daily intake, ADI, and acute reference dose per day, ARFD, for TFA. EFSA is currently proposing an ADI at 0.03 milligrams per kilogram body weight and an ARFD of 0.6 milligrams per kilogram body weight, both based on sodium trifluoroacetate, and is expected to announce its conclusion next February. EFSA's original ADI of 0.05 milligrams per kilogram body weight was set in 2014. Meanwhile, the EU has provisionally added TFA to its list of priority contaminants in surface and groundwater. Evidence that TFA could cause reproductive toxicity has already led the Commission to conclude this year that it is a toxicologically relevant metabolite of PFAS pesticides, restricting its lawful concentration in groundwater to no more than 0.1 micrograms per liter, a level already exceeded in many areas in Europe. In assessing the 2 rabbit studies, Pan-Europe said they provided clear and consistent evidence of serious fetal abnormalities, affecting both soft tissues, eyes, and skeletal structures. The NGO noted that the TFA task force proposed a no observed adverse effect level, NOAL, of 60 milligrams per kilogram per day, even though liver toxicity in mother rabbits was already evident at that dose. Moreover, at 30 milligrams per kilogram per day, altered blood chemistry was observed in the mother rabbits, indicating systemic effects and suggesting that the NOAL should be set even lower, said PAN Europe. PAN Europe said that in the second rabbit study, TFA levels in the feed and water of the exposed animals were not taken into account. While TFA contamination was detected in the control group, up to 0.626 milligrams per liter in the female rabbits. This was not considered in the study conclusions, which could explain some of the skeletal malformations seen in this group, the NGO said, adding that this could potentially mask effects at low doses and suggest that the true NOAEL could be lower than reported. Rat studies. In addition to rabbits, rats have been the focus of several TFA toxicity studies. In an extended one-generation study of rats in 2021, Solvay and Bayer claimed no adverse reproductive effects from TFA exposure. However, said Pan Europe, a closer look reveals overlooked signs of harm in offspring, including reduced thyroid hormone levels, changed weight of reproductive organs, testes and epididymis, liver changes, blood biochemistry alterations, and sperm abnormalities, even at lower exposures. Some limited data in the extended one-generation study were given for female and male rat offspring of 13 weeks at high exposure, where eye malformations were reported in females. Skeletal malformations were not evaluated. and as a result, comparisons could not be made to the rabbit studies where such effects were observed. Despite these gaps in findings, the industry proposed an unrealistically high NOAEL of 250 milligrams per kilogram per day, said PAN Europe. The chemical companies also attempted to downplay TFA-induced eye malformations toxicity by proposing a rabbit-specific mechanism tied to lactate transport disruption, said PAN Europe. But these malformations occurred at TFA levels below the proposed hypothetical threshold calculated to trigger such effects, undermining their own argument, said the NGO. Moreover, evidence from multiple rat studies, including data from Bayer, showed eye malformations in adult rats as well. This suggests the eye is a general target organ, not limited to rabbits, the NGO said. Rather than acknowledging a cross-species pattern, industry dismisses the rat findings by claiming the results fall within historical control data ranges, added Pan Europe. This deflection fails to address the consistency of effects across studies, reinforcing the conclusion that TFA's toxicity is not species-specific. PAN Europe also critiqued the drinking water limit proposed by the TFA task force, which is far above that set by a number of European countries. 2 countries, Denmark and Italy, have adopted binding TFA drinking water parameters, 9 micrograms per liter and 10 micrograms per liter, respectively. Other countries have set guideline values. The Netherlands, 2.2 micrograms per liter, Belgium, Wallonia, 2.2, Luxembourg, 12, Belgium, Flanders, 16.5, France, 60, and Germany, 60. By contrast, the TFA task force has proposed a value of 294 micrograms per liter, noted Pan Europe. The Health and Environment Alliance, HEAL, recently published a review of PFAS protection measures in Europe, including those that pertain to TFA. A 1984 study on pregnant mice mentioned in the Pan Europe report deserves emphasis, said Norwegian scientist ARP. It raised concerns about the anesthetic agent halothane, which metabolizes into TFA protein molecules linked to hepatotoxic and neurotoxic effects. This was one of the key reasons halothane was phased out of the market, he noted. Other sectors should take note of this precedent. Industry comments. NaturalRefrigerants.com reached out to chemical producers and trade groups for comment on the PAN Europe report. BASF, Syngenta, Corteva, Chemours, Honeywell, the TFA REACH Consortium, and CropLife Europe did not respond. Angelica Candido, sector manager for CEFIC, the European Chemical Industry Council, declined to comment, adding that CEFIC does not speak on behalf of individual companies. Leverkusen, Germany-based Bayer, manufacturer of pesticides that break down into TFA such as flufenacet, now banned in the EU, diflufenicin and fluoperam, did comment. Following the results of the latest scientific studies conducted on TFA, including relevant monitoring data, it is important to say that there is no indication for any risk from real-life TFA exposure for human health or the environment, said Simone Keiss, Senior Communications Manager for Bayer. Such exposure also covers the potential TFA originating from the responsible use of our products. This also includes the consumption of drinking water in the EU, which is safe. Even if the proposed new classification of TFA as reproductively toxic will be confirmed by the classification procedure of ECHA, we are not aware of any science-based conclusion that would change this assessment, added Keiss. To be very clear, the toxicological data and the generic risk assessment on TFA submitted to regulators do not indicate any health risk for humans or wild mammals for the label-compliant use of our products. Brussels-based Solvay, which will cease its TFA production by early 2026, also commented. Solvay strongly rejects the claim that the company deliberately delayed or distorted the risk assessment of TFA, trifluoroacetic acid, said Peter Bollert, External Communication Director. This substance has been registered for many years under the European REACH regulation, based on assessments carried out by independent recognized specialized bodies. At the request of ECHA, European Chemicals Agency, Solvay conducted long-term toxicity studies and has always provided the authorities with information on the intermediate results, added Bollert. It is up to national and European regulatory authorities to proceed with an appropriate classification of TFA. In past responses to concerns about TFA, the fluorochemical industry has pointed to the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, and its 2022 Environmental Effects Assessment Panel EEAP report. The report says that TFA is not bioaccumulative, is not expected to pose significant risk to humans or the environment at the present time, and is unlikely to cause adverse effects out to 2100. However, it added, monitoring of the environment for residues of TFA would provide an early warning if trends in concentration indicate rapid increases. The EEAP report does not comment on the contribution of pesticides and other precursors to TFA since they don't fall under the purview of the Montreal Protocol.